Welcome to Talking Maine with the Bowtie Boys. I'm Representative Tom Saviello, and my partner tonight had to work, unfortunately, but I do have a pleasure tonight. I have the pleasure of having Paul Mills, a local historian, a local attorney. You actually closed on my house many years ago.
Sure.
And Paul has agreed to come and talk to me because, as many of you know, we had a gazillion guys running for governor. So, but we're not going to talk so much about this race, but some of the past races and things that you might find interesting. Paul,
hey Tom,
welcome to our show. It is good to have you here with us.
This is good to be here.
It's a pleasure. Right. Thanks for coming to do this. You know, we already started rambling before the TV cameras got on, and because I was telling you that 1972 was my first year in the state of Maine. I was a graduate student at Orono. And I can remember that was, to me, I recall, that was the first year that students could vote, where they constitutionally had someone who said that was your residence, I could go vote. I can remember, as I told you, going in to vote for McGovern. Yes, that's right. I voted for George McGovern. I had long hair, longer than now. I can remember walking in, and I have to tell you this quick story. I walked in, and the first thing the ballot clerk said to me, wouldn't challenge my vote, but my roommate was right behind me, or in front of me. They challenged his vote because he was a student, and I walked right in. My roommate, being the wise guy he was, looked at the guy and said, well, I challenge your vote. He said, well, you can't do that. And I got him all shook up. But I said to you, well, who ran for governor in 72? Nobody. It was 74. So who was governor in 74?
Well, Kenneth Curtis was going out as governor, and I'm glad you picked that year, because that clearly was one of the more dramatic upsets in Maine politics that whole year, for a lot of reasons. That was the year when Maine, for the first time anywhere in the country since 1930, elected someone other than a Republican or a Democrat to be governor of Maine.
That's right, because Jim was an independent, wasn't he?
That's right. He had been a Democrat, former Democrat, just like you and Charlie Webster and a lot of other people who might have been former Democrats. But he was a former Democrat who had run on, it was at a time, it was a similar situation to now in some ways. It was sort of coming out of a recession. And there was a distaste for politics as usual, partly because of the Watergate phenomenon and the aftermath of the Vietnam War. And he was a come from the behind, last minute kind of surge that he squeaked by George Mitchell.
Oh, he ran against
George Mitchell was the Democratic nominee.
That's correct. That's right. Yeah. Who was the Republican nominee?
Jim Irwin, who had run for the third time. Irwin had come within about 800 votes of winning in 1970 against Kenneth Curtis, when Curtis was running for re-election. But Irwin came in at about 24% at that time, and so the race is kind of like between the top two, the independent and the Democrat. George Mitchell lost. It was both his first race for office as well as Longley's first race for office. Yeah.
And you're right, at that time in 72, 74, there was, just like we are almost dealing with now, a lot of distrust for government, and to have an independent come along and say, I'm going to run, that made it interesting. Now, one of the things that we talked about that I remembered is that Longley, as we know, unfortunately died of cancer, but he all of a sudden surprised everybody by announcing he wasn't running for re-election, and we were speculating a little bit why we think that happened.
Well, part of it, his announced reasoning was that he had made a pledge during the campaign that he would serve only one term. Many people make that kind of pledge. Susan Collins made the pledge that she would only seek 2 terms, and she sought a 3rd term. And there are typically, more often than not, incumbent political figures who sometimes reassess that position. And clearly he was reassessing it. But he came down on the side of not, only a couple of days before the filing deadline, actually in the end of March of 1978, when he came up for re-election, decided to refrain from running again. I think there were family pressures. I think that he had 5 kids, and some of them were teenagers in their 20s or whatever, and they had never been in the public eye before. And I think that his family found it slightly distasteful, very controversial governor, and was always making news. And he as an independent, had a very formidable time. He was extremely popular, and he would have been reelected. But he didn't have any legislative base. And 67 of his vetoes were overridden.
No kidding. I was just going to ask. I can remember
legislature.
now as back that there were a lot of vetoes that he put into place.
Some of them were not overridden. Well, most notably, one of them, he shares with Governor Baxter the distinction of having another governor who vetoed a lot of legislation. Baxter in the 20s, Longley in the 70s share one thing. They vetoed a bill to create the University of Maine Medical School. And that was not overridden in the 1920s, was not overridden in the 1970s.
I can remember because when I was in graduate school at Orono, we really thought that we were going to have a medical school there, and they actually started bringing some staff in. I took microbiology from an individual who came in there specifically to ultimately be part of the medical school when it started. I do remember that. That's right. Now, was it a Democrat or a Republican legislature at the time?
It was a Democratic. You qualify that in some ways. Overall, it was Democratic because the Democrats controlled the caucus, the joint convention. But the Republicans controlled the Senate. Joe Sewell was the Senate president. The Democrats controlled the House. But overall, the Democrats had a majority between the two chambers so that your constitutional officers like Secretary of State and Attorney General were Democratic. And the first year of Longley's administration was also the very first year that John Martin was Speaker of the House.
Oh, that must have been interesting.
And they both had very strong agendas. They were both very heavily committed people. And the tension, of course, between the two of them was very significant. The Democratic leader in the Senate was Jerry Connolly, and the Republican Senate president was Joe Sewell from Old Town. But Sewell, I think Longley had an easier time with most Republicans than he did with the Democrats, even though Longley himself had been a former Democrat.
Didn't know. So let's go back in time. We talked about 72. What are some of the other interesting ones? I mean, I know a little bit about Muskies, but let's.
Sure.
What ones did you pick out?
Well, of course, we had a civil war practically over one election for governor, and that was when we had a mandatory runoff. No candidate received, 40%, then, which frequently happened, and we elected a governor every year. It was called the count out of 79. And in fact, a lawyer from Phillips, who was the Deputy Secretary of State, Prince Sawyer at the time, threw the state seal in the Kennebec River to keep the Republicans from getting it.
No kidding.
And one of the heroes of Gettysburg was Joshua Chamberlain, who himself by that time had been a former governor as well as a general in the Civil War, was called upon for a special occasion to quell potential violence and significant tensions. And there were two legislatures meeting at the same time, both contending to be the legitimate legislature, and two people contending to be governor at the same time. And it took a Maine Supreme Court ruling and the intervention of Joshua Chamberlain to settle it. And that was when a Republican named Davis eventually prevailed. What had happened then, and there's a little bit of an illustrative value for today's contemporary politics in what was going on. We'll get to that in a second because it does have relevance. If no candidate received a clear
Majority,
vote,
right.
then it would go to the House of Representatives, who would then pick any two of the candidates who got votes.
Didn't matter whether they.
That's right. Didn't matter whether they were number one or number two. So what happened was the county, the House, the dominant party in the House would sometimes forward two candidates who might not include one of the top two contenders in order to manipulate the outcome, and then the Senate would pick from among the two that the House sent forward. There was a significant dispute over the warrants for election for many of the members of the House, and so that whether the House was properly constituted. There were two House of Representatives, and so it went through a very chaotic situation. There was a physician from Lewiston named Garcelon who was the incumbent, and he lost ultimately to Daniel Davis, who's Republican, in this. The outcome of that was that ever since then, Maine has never had a requirement that you achieve a majority or achieve a significant. They abolished that because it created such tension. And I guess the thought hadn't occurred to them that much to have an actual runoff, a new election, which they do in almost all southern states except Tennessee. If there's, for example, no majority winner in a primary election, in Maine, the plurality makes it, both in the primary and the election ever since 1880. And it also, one outcome of that is that they extended the gubernatorial terms from 1 year to 2 years, became 4 years in the late 50s.
1879,
right.
That's when it went to 2 years, is it?
Well, after that election it did, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah, right.
Wow. Wow, that's interesting, because I do know, like, Louisiana recently has had some of those votes where they had a very, the plurality wasn't there,
right.
so they had the re-election between the two top candidates.
Right, and they do that in their elections. Most southern states do that in their primaries, and a few of the southern states, like Louisiana, have the runoff election for the general election as well.
See, that's interesting, because if we still had that in place, John Baldacci would have had a runoff against Merrill.
Well, that's where it gets to be relevant, because only in the last 35 years, in every election beginning in 1974, all our governors have been minority governors,
none of them,
except
Angus
Brennan in 1982 when he ran for re-election against Charlie Cragen, and Angus King in 1998 when he won like 56% of the vote against Tom Connolly, the Democrat. Jim Longley Jr. was the Republican, and against Pat LaMarche, come up with about 7% of the vote as the Green Party candidate in 1998. But despite the fact that he had 3 opponents, he won a re-election. So, but other than that, all of our other gubernatorial elections, as Baldacci won 38% against Chandler Woodcock, with 30, and Barbara Merrill somewhere around 23%, and down the slate there was about 8 or 9% for
Carter.
The next one down.
Yeah. It was interesting. In 1982 was really the first time politically that I got involved in an election. My neighbor, his name was Eric Brennan. He was a 5th cousin of Joe Brennan.
Yeah.
And Joe came up to have a breakfast at Eric's house, and so they asked me at the time, I had a camera and I knew how to take pictures, if I would take pictures of him being there.
Yeah.
And so my reward is I got elected to the Pesticide Control Board in 1983 because they were looking for somebody as a forester to put on there, and they asked me if I'd worked on somebody's campaign. I said, yes, son of a gun, I worked on Joe Brennan's campaign. That was the first time. And the second time was Angus King's first run for election. I'd heard him speak, and I thought he was very impressive, and I helped him with a lot of questions on his environmental stuff, not knowing where it would lead me. But I worked on Angus's campaign then both times. And so I do know about the second time. First time he won, I was in Florida, or the kids at Disney World, and with another friend of the family, and we were down there listening, trying to get, as I call it, the scores coming across CNN, because we're down there and you can't see it. And they'd always get you to like the state before Maine, and then they'd have a commercial, and they'd come back on again, and they'd be to the state after Maine. So he didn't know what was going on until they called us and told us he had finally won. So, and you're right, he did not. He got about 38 or 39% that first election.
It was down about 35, 34 because. You had a strong Republican candidate.
Susan
Collins had about 23, 24%. Joe, that was a very close election, really, not quite recount material, but King was about 35, Brennan was about 34%, and then you also had
Jonathan Carter.
Carter was pulling up about 6% too, and Susan Collins 23, 24. So there was a lower mandate him that time than when he ran again, but. He had an easier time with the legislature, although it was not easy. But nevertheless, he proved himself somewhat more susceptible to, amenable to compromise than I think Longley had. And he sided with the Republicans on a lot of fiscal, some fiscal issues, and also the Democrats. He worked both ways that way. But he certainly sided with the Republicans on labor issues. As we know, he vetoed a number of changes the Democrats want to do there.
Yep, right. What other ones are interesting from what your little work had done? Because I got some.
Well, we have a number of experiences in Maine with third and fourth party candidates. For example, in the 30s and as late as 1940, one of the third party candidates in 3 of our elections was a Communist Party candidate, including the first woman who ran for governor of Maine was a woman named Helen Knudsen, who was the Communist Party candidate for governor of Maine in 1940. Now, you think back, though, in the context of it, not that communists had the highest reputation at that time, but they didn't have quite the same kind of subversive connotations as they did during the Cold War. This is, after all, we were allies with Stalin and the Soviets during World War II and whatever. So in the 30s and 40s, yes, it was considered to be a somewhat extremist and radical position, but nevertheless, it wasn't as if you were illegal, or you were going to overthrow the country. So 3 times there. Every election we also had a socialist nominee in the 30s in one of those campaigns. And then during from 1880 to 1916, every 2 years in a gubernatorial election, we also had a third party candidate who was the Prohibitionist Party candidate. And Chester Greenwood was the Prohibitionist Party candidate for the Maine State Senate in the late 1890s.
He didn't have
from
anything.
Franklin.
That's how he invented earmuffs, because he had nothing to keep his ears warm.
Franklin County. Yeah, maybe. His wife was a very ardent prohibitionist, and the prohibition movement closely allied with the women's suffrage movement at the time. In fact, that's one of the ways where women were gaining traction and getting the right to vote, is because Republicans were, as well as Prohibitionist Party, were felt that women would be pro-prohibition. And so they tended to favor giving them the right to vote in a number of states where they achieved it. Democrats happen to be against women getting the right to vote because they tended to be against prohibition at that time.
It's interesting because historically, it weren't the Republicans under Lincoln that freed the slaves.
Yeah.
Now you're telling me they're the ones that helped get women to vote.
Yes.
What happened between now and then? No, I'm only kidding.
Right.
It's very interesting to see that that's where the Republicans came from and where their roots are. That's really, interesting. So we actually had a communist that ran for governor. That's really interesting.
In a number of states. And in fact, there was a communist who was a regular lobbyist in the 30s, during the 40s, in the Maine legislature. Very conservative appearing person, wore a suit and bow tie and everything, nothing.
Be careful now.
Nothing, or a regular tie, whatever. But conservative in cosmetically anyway, and very soft-spoken fellow by the name of Gordon. He lived in Starks at one time and in Madison. And he would appear on legislation and say that he was representing the Communist Party and felt that the legislature should do, typically on a lot of labor issues and social issues and things like that. Yeah.
Wow. So what other, these are really interesting to me. When did we change to 4-year terms?
But constitutional amendment took effect with the 1958 election.
Oh, wow.
But the person who was elected died in office at the end of the first year, just 50 years ago last month. Dr. Clinton Clausen, a chiropractor. And so he never fulfilled the 4-year term to which he was elected. So then they had a special election in 1960 where the person who succeeded him, the incumbent John Reed, ran for the 2 years to fill out the term. And then Reed was the first one to actually fulfill a 4-year term, running in 1962.
62. So during, and Reed was a Republican, correct?
Yes.
And was Clausen a Republican?
No, he was a Democrat.
He was a Democrat.
That's one of the systems of our succession, that is not necessarily guaranteed to be succeeded by the same party, a person of the same party that was elected in the first place.
Then who stepped up after his death? Was it the President of the Senate?
Yes.
So the President of the Senate then became the acting governor and that's the way our Constitution reads. We don't have a lieutenant governor that would step in.
We're one of only about 6 or 7 states that has no lieutenant governor.
So do you remember who the President of the Senate was then?
Well, that was John Reed. Of course,
it
succeeded to Clausen
I understand
at that time.
So John Reed was a senator at the time and then moved. So the Republicans still had control of the legislature. From
Aroostook County. He just turned 89 a few days ago. I talked with him on the phone last week.
No kidding.
Yes, Washington, D.C. He comes up to a camp in North Pond and Smithfield for about 6 weeks during the year. Religiously attends the Skowhegan Fair horse racing activities. He's a big horse racing person. He used to own a lot of horse races himself, particularly as a potato farmer up in Aroostook County in Fort Fairfield, where he originally came from. But after he was governor, he became a member of the National Transportation Safety Board, appointed by a Democrat, President Johnson, to that board, later became chair of it, and then he was ambassador to Sri Lanka on 2 different occasions, under Nixon, Ford, then later under Reagan. In that, and then he is very alert and very cognizant and interactive with the views of what's going on, and living in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, I remember when I first got here and him then being in some of those administrations, and they talked to him about being a former governor of the state of Maine. Now, Ken Kurz, he then Muskie, wasn't that the surprise vote? I've been told that when Muskie got elected, it was kind of a surprise.
Well, that was an upset. Partly, in the first place, because he was a Democrat when we had been typically a Republican state for quite a bit of time. We'd had a Democrat elected twice in the 1930s during the Depression, Louis Brand from Lewiston. So it wasn't unheard of, but the Republicans had still always controlled the legislature and had been the prohibitive favorite in winning statewide elections, the United States Senate and governorship. So in 1954, when Muskie was nominated and he challenged the sitting incumbent governor, Burton Cross, it was an upset because he defeated an incumbent, also an upset because he was a Democrat winning in a typically Republican state.
Did Cross take it for granted? Is that
no? I mean, of course, there was a recession then, and
so he got blamed for everything.
And that was the first television election. And Muskie was very good on television. We didn't have statewide television in the previous gubernatorial election, 1952. So by 1954, you had the Portland TV stations, 6 and 13. You had also Channel 5 up in Bangor. And so Muskie was considered a better presence on television. Cross was not considered to be quite as charismatic as Muskie, and Muskie and Cross was perceived to have alienated a number of Republicans by his style of appointments and some of what he'd done. Although Cross was a highly competent governor, he himself also had been president of the state senate. But Muskie had been in the legislature, and although he had lost when he ran for mayor of Waterville, lost to a Republican a few years before that. But Muskie was well known among a lot of Democratic figures and had come up through the ranks and was a Cornell graduate of law school there, originally from Rumford. Bob Chassey from Farmington had actually grown up in the same neighborhood as Muskie. And Muskie had a following in this area too. So there were so-called Muskie Republicans that supported him, as well as, of course, Democrats. And he was profoundly popular personally and won.
But when Muskie we know what he did when he went to the Senate, certainly with pollution and the air laws and the water laws. But as a governor, was there anything that earmarked that you could identify with his particular reign as governor?
Well, an emphasis on industrial development. I think the Industrial Guarantee Authority, a predecessor to some of our state guarantee authorities, came into effect. Then economic development. Working with the Republicans, because the Republicans continued to control the legislature and controlled the executive council, was an earmark of his administration. It was a disposition toward compromise. The sales tax went from 2% to 3% during his administration. He had a theme of trying to achieve some degree of government reorganization, but was not quite as successful in it. The Sinclair Act, passed in 1957 during his administration, which was first major modern school consolidation act. That's not the first one really, but in any event, the one that brought in the school administrative district system over a period of years, passed during his administration. So
interesting. Who was the governor when we put income tax into place?
Curtis was the governor, but the Republicans controlled the legislature, and that was an outcome of some interesting forces. There were a lot of Democrats who actually opposed the income tax. There were a lot of more Republicans than not actually were for it at that time. Harry Richardson was the floor leader, a conservative Republican by the name of David Kennedy was Speaker of the House, and he supported it. So you had a couple of liberal Republicans from suburban Portland were against it, I think partly because they knew the pocketbooks of their constituents would be more affected. Like Dick Hughes, for example, a socially liberal Republican who voted against the income tax, but his constituency was Cape Elizabeth, so I might explain that. And there's a need perceived at that time to fulfill the subsidy requirements to subsidize local education that the Sinclair Act had imposed upon state government. More of these school administrative districts have been formed, so there was a lot of school construction going on, and in order to do that, there was a strike at the Augusta State Hospital about the same month that the income tax passed, and there was sort of a crisis mentality about what to do, and government was about to shut down and that type of thing. And so it went through. They had to achieve it with a 2/3 vote of both the House and the Senate. And then there was an election 2 years later whereby through the citizen initiative process, income tax was challenged in order to, not a people's veto, because it went into effect immediately because it was emergency legislation with a 2/3 vote. But surprisingly, in November of 1971, a couple of years after it was passed, by 75% of the vote, the people voted to keep the income tax, interestingly enough.
And it's interesting you say that it was the school consolidation, the Sinclair Act, that started this, because of those of us that argue that the consolidation we just went through really doesn't save any money. It does on paper if they want to, but realistically, we're struggling with how we're going to deal with all this stuff, because now we're going backwards as far as finances are concerned. So that's really interesting. Paul, as we get close to the end of the show, is there any one governor that sticks out in your mind as probably doing the best job as the governor, that with whatever, because I mean, I've been there 7 years and we've got a crisis every year, but that really has come through the best of anybody would have expected or better?
Well, I think Tudor Gardner, elected in 1928, re-elected in 1930. He was successful in obtaining the legislature's approval and subsequent popular ratification in a referendum of a big government reorganization plan that consolidated a lot of the state government agencies. And he was a Republican, also a very intriguing war hero. After he'd been governor, he was one of our younger governors. He was only about 36 when he first came in. And he played a major role, and a very courageous role in World War II, in the war in Italy, in which he went under disguise and got into Rome before the Allies invaded it, and sought out some Italian leaders to see if they would collaborate with the Americans when the Americans invaded, knowing full well that, of course, the Nazis controlled the country, and he escaped, went back, so it was known as much for his military heroism. Several years after he was governor, he was also a veteran of World War I.
Wow.
Intriguingly enough. Yeah.
Well, that's kind of an interesting governor, because to do that and come out as a young age and then go and do that. And then, when 28, that's right at the end of or beginning of the Great Depression too, right around in that period of time. So they come in there and reorganize government like that, that's a pretty brave thing to do. And he never came back with any ambitions to run for governor again, huh?
Sometimes thought about it. He was killed in a plane crash in 1953. He was driving his own plane, actually, in Pennsylvania, going to a reunion of his World War I outfit going on like that.
Now, how about modern governors? Anybody that kind of sticks out in your mind?
Well, Longley was one of the most unusual. He made good copy. He was making news, very relentlessly doing something in a very astonishing way. And you almost wouldn't have thought he was governor, because he spent as much time, he was the most dramatic governor. He may not have been good, may not have been bad. I'm not going to make that value judgment, but he's one of the more memorable governors. And it was almost as if he was running against the government while a part of it.
Yeah,
because there was so much of the governmental establishment that he was against. And he sort of illustrated the limitations of being governor, particularly if you don't have any party base in the legislature. But he still could be effective in some ways, particularly with the veto power. And he made some enormously brilliant appointments to the court. He really took politics out of judicial appointments in a clear way. Because he was independent, didn't have a party base, he wasn't rewarding Republicans or Democrats. And so Vincent McCusick was placed as the Chief Justice of the Maine Supreme Court, who would not put there for any kind of partisan reasons. It also happened to be when John Benoit was appointed the district court judge here in Franklin County. Not anything to do with any kind of political kind of situation. And so he was notable for his taking partisanship out of judicial appointments. Not that other governors didn't make good judicial appointments, many of them did, but there was often in many of the appointments, not all of them, for judicial roles, some affinity for the political persuasion of a particular nominee for the judiciary. So you can't forget him for all kinds of different reasons.
You know, and that's a good place to kind of end the show, because we've really talked a lot about the different governors, and soon we'll have a chance to choose one of 24, or depending on the party.
I'm sure there'll be a little attrition. There probably won't be that many making it onto the ballot.
It's kind of exciting to see who's going to announce today, and I can guarantee you, I'm not doing it.
Yeah.
So.
Neither am I.
Good. Paul and I are not running for governor. I want you to note that. I want to thank you, Paul, for coming on the show.
Tom, it's been a pleasure.
It's a pleasure. Yeah. And this is Tom Saviello of Talkin' Maine for the Bowtie Boys. And good night, and thanks for tuning in. That was great.